When Britain declared war on the 4th of August 1914, many First Nation communities and their leaders openly declared their loyalty and sought avenues to exemplify their allegiance to the worth of both Canada and the Crown. The majority of treaties and military alliances were forged with Britain and not with Canada. Many communities offered their support of men and money directly to the King or the Great White Father. The majority believed that by entering and engaging in Canadian society as First Nations, that they could participate on equal terms and win the respect of the dominant non-First Nation society in order to gain rights for their own people. Accordingly, many viewed the First World War as an extension of this approach. First Nationers have been worthy British and French allies during the colonial wars in which Britain and France vied for North American hegemony. While First Nationers lost their military importance as a collective, individual First Nation men continued to support the British military campaigns after the War of 1812, when mustered by Imperial Canadian authorities. Given this pattern of allegiance towards the British Crown, First Nation enthusiasm towards the First World War was not historically unfounded. The 1904 Militia Act also identified those Canadians eligible for military service. The Act, however, made no specific mention of the First Nations. Although their use and value had diminished after the War of 1812, in times of need they were still called upon to provide their valuable skills in assisting Canadian or Imperial ventures. With the ignition of hostilities, the majority of British and Canadian politicians and senior commanders believed that the war would be over by Christmas. Within this general atmosphere, Canada had made an unofficial exclusionist policy regarding the First Nationers' enlistment. The war, however, was not over by Christmas and was not short-lived, and both Canadian and First Nation contributions overseas and on the home front in support of the British Empire increased dramatically over the course of the next 4.5 years of horrific warfare. Although the majority of First Nation leaders and peoples offered their immediate support to the war effort, their active participation remained dependent on the existing 1904 Militia Act or the absence of any clear policy on the whims of the federal government. Throughout 1914, the general policy towards the First Nation service remained one of exclusion or limited involvement. On the 8th of August, 4 days after the British declared war on the Central Powers, the Minister of Militia, Sir Sam Hughes, received a query from the Colonel William Egerton Huggins, Antskin. Is it intended that the Indians who are anxious to enlist for service overseas are to be taken in contingents? Hughes replied the same day with, while British troops would be proud to be associated with their fellow subjects, the First Nationers, yet Germans might refuse to extend them the privileges of civilized warfare, therefore considered they would be better remained in Canada to share the protection of the Dominion. Throughout 1914, First Nation men rushed to recruiting deports for reasons other than loyalty to the British Crown. Although the warrior ethnic had been stagnated by the result of residential schooling, religious education, and isolation on reserves, it had not been completely repressed. While many joined for money, adventure, and employment as did their white comrades, scores of other enlistees tried to revive the warrior tradition and gain social status within their communities. War in Europe seemed to be a feasible means to circumvent governmental policies on the Indian Act and offer freedom and escape from docile reservist life. Throughout 1914, the war was generally met with jingoism outpouring in the British segments of Canada, and support for the Imperial government was given in the form of men, material, and money. The outward support of the war given by most First Nation leaders did not, in all cases, reflect the opinions of those who they purportedly represented. Many First Nationers did not endorse the recruitment of their men for a European war. This was no different from the divisions within the Euro-Canadian population and should be viewed as such. Most French Canadians and some Irish Canadians did not back the war effort either. For many First Nation leaders seeking full and equal sovereignty, support offered directly from the Crown was viewed as a means to lobby the Imperial government to put pressure on Canada to alter oppressive laws. As the war progressed and the Canadian forces expand and also had a horrific casualty rate due to modern warfare on the Western Front, Canadian policies regarding First Nation service altered substantially to provide a greater inclusion to meet the pragmatic requirements for manpower. Within the general atmosphere in October 1915, the British War Office issued the most important imperial documents of the war pertaining Indigenes in all dominions. On the 8th of October 1915, all Governor-Generals and all administrators of British dominions and colonies received a confidential memorandum from the Canadian-born Colonial Secretary Andrew Boer Law. The Cabinet has asked for a report as to the possibilities of raising native troops in large numbers in our colonies and protectorates for imperial service. What is wanted is an assessment of the numbers that could be raised, the length of time they could be needed for training, an opinion to their fighting value, and any permanent remarks on such points as climatic restrictions on their employment, the influence of religion, and the difficulties of authorizing. The second request was sent on the 18th of October. This was actually intended for military inclusion of Indigenous men. Borlaug wrote a third, albeit not the direct call from behalf of the king on the 25th of October, and the following circular letter to all dominions and all colonies was issued on the 10th of December 1915. This regulation had never been altered since that time. The response to the change in First Nation enlistment policies were overwhelming. A number of battalions formed after December 1915 had a high percentage of First Nationers, although none could rival 107th from 114th, which had 50 to 75% First Nations in its composition. Most were dispatched overseas in 1916, although save for the 107th were broken up as reinforcements, many boosting the First Nationers' complexion of the enduring 107th. In November 1916, the DIA released a widely published and widely distributed of known First Nation enlistments, 1,187 in newspapers across the country. The same report stated that First Nations had donated $24,679.30 or 30 cents in various war funds. Canadian recruitment policies at the outbreak of war and into 1915 could not sustain national formations in the face of mounting casualties and a decline in voluntary enlistment and an expanding expeditionary force. Canada introduced conscription with the controversial Military Service Bill on the 11th of June 1917. Confusion and capricious policies converting the position of the First Nations were immediate and pronounced. On the 29th of August, the Military Service Act, the MSA, legally sanctioned conscription for the First Nations. This act appealed to all male British subjects in Canada, including First Nations, Asians, and blacks, between the ages of 20 and 40. Driven by the necessities of the war, Canada's policy towards the First Nation military service has shifted in the opposite direction as it was in 1914. Before the closing registration date on the 1st of February had arrived to allow First Nationers to enlist in Ottawa, however, Ottawa had passed a legalization exempting First Nationers and Japanese from the terms of the MSA based on the tenses of prior treaties. The need for manpower, however, drastically influenced the military position of First Nationers during 1917 and 1918, and voluntary recruitment drives were undertaken on reserves across the country. In addition to serving as snipers and scouts, Canadian First Nation men were also employed in other branches of combat arms and auxiliary formations, except for the Royal Tank Corps. They served in the both Royal Naval Canadian Volunteer Reserve and the Royal Navy. 3 members of the defunct 114th Battalion served as pilots in the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Air Force. One Lieutenant Oliver Milton Martin went on to serve in the Second World War, attaining the rank of Brigadier General, the highest position ever attained from the Canadian Forces by a First Nation soldier. At least 17 First Nation men were commissioned as officers in the CEF during the First World War. For the Canadian First Nationers shared equally in the burdens of war, and they still remind the government of their sacrifices for king and country. First Nation casualty rates, however, cannot be precisely calculated, since military records generally do not go for race. But it is known for certain that at least 4,000 status Indians served in the CEF, and they suffered roughly 1,200 casualties. These numbers exclude non-status Indians and Inuits and Métis, and based on the 1914 status Indian population of 10,3,774. While the number of Canadian First Soldiers awarded honours were not officially known, veterans of the Affairs of Canada stated that at least 50 medals were awarded to Aboriginal people in Canada for bravery and heroism. The First Nation women also form a patriotic and Red Cross societies for their reserves. They made bandages, knitted various items of clothing, and raised funds for selling traditional crafts. The Canadian Red Cross Society stated that the article by the First Nation women, they were the finest quality of knitting and sewing they had received. By the end of the war, First Nationers had donated almost $45,000 to war funds. Nevertheless, significant First Nation participation in the war effort, both on and off the battlefield, did little to alter the governmental policies. First Nation veteran Private Daniel Pettelerter remarked, "The Army treated us all right. There was no discrimination over there, and we were treated good." This relative equality, however, did not manifest in government veteran programs and benefits, and the First Nation men and women remained wards of the state under the Pantelistic Indian Act. First Nation veterans also did not receive equal considerations for pensions, disabilities, or war veterans allowance, despite the promises. Following the service, with their service no longer required, First Nation soldiers returned to the position of unwanted peoples and did not receive equitable rights to veterans. The inclusion of the First Nationers in the CEF was a pragmatic decision. This inclusion was not intended to transcend contemporary social, political, or cultural norms within the Canadian society. The elevated and unprecedented participation of the First Nationers, however, during the First World War, this was a potential catalyst to accelerate their attainment to equal rights. This did not happen, and the authoritarian policies prevailed, and the recognition of the First Nation military contributions were fast forgotten. And that's it, the First Nationals of World War One. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. If you want to learn about another First Nationer during the First World War, you can click on Francis Pego somewhere in the corner. And if you want to learn about Canada, which should hopefully be the first one, you could see the other Canadians, the white Canadians or the British Canadians in the other corner or whatever, which one comes first. Anyway, hope you enjoyed, hope you learned something, and yeah, that's pretty much it. Enjoy.